Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Crown Grey Cocon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're asking a question of what if President McKinley was never assassinated? Now, just for a little bit of context with this, but we're going to get into the context first and then go into the alternative history as we always do. So, first of all, we have to understand that this is probably the most likely of all the different alternative scenarios we've ever done, right? Because most of the other ones kind of rely on, this strange thing happening or that strange happening or something very unlikely, yeah. But this case here was actually a very, very preventable kind of thing, right? So just a little bit of context, basically, President McKinley, and a few months into his second term, he was assassinated, right? So what ended up happening was you had this anarchist called Leon Czolgosz, I think that's how you pronounce his name. But Leon Czolgosz, he first became a socialist during the Panic of 1893 when he lost his job. So as a result, he ended up becoming very radicalized. He ended up basically turning against the whole system, and so he thought the best way to put a middle finger up to the whole system was basically by assassinating the US president. So President McKinley was visiting Buffalo in New York for the World Fair there. So he visited Niagara Falls in that morning, and then he went to go and see the fair. But as he was going in the fair, and he was shaking hands with the different people in the crowd, and it was there that Leon Czolgosz came up to him with a bandage around his hand. And as he came to, basically go and shake the man's hand, Leon Czolgosz fired 2 shots straight into McKinley's chest. Now, the interesting thing with all this is that at this fair, you had a very early X-ray machine, right? So this was, you had the means to actually find where the bullet had gone. There were also some notable surgeons in the surrounding area, but famously, one of them said, even if the US president needs me, I'm busy, I'm not able to go, right? And so as a result, it ended up being a thing where there were relatively inexperienced surgeons who end up dealing with the president. And, they refused to use the X-ray because they thought it might end up, making the president more sick, because it was very new technology, so they didn't really trust it at that point. And so basically what they end up doing is they end up sewing up his wound, and they hadn't cleaned it out properly, and the wound ended up getting infected. And so while McKinley, he seemed to be recovering, and so they almost gonna release him from hospital, and then all of a sudden he suddenly went very downhill and ended up dying. So who ended up taking over from him? Well, it was his vice president, and this vice president turned out to be Theodore Roosevelt, right? Who at the time was the youngest president of all American history. So with the exception of President Kennedy, he's still to this day the youngest president as well. And, so Teddy Roosevelt, he was a very popular man. He joined the ticket in the election of 1900 because, the party bosses wanted someone who was very popular. McKinley himself was, very, very different from Teddy Roosevelt, and he didn't initially want him on the ticket, but, he was kind of convinced by people in the party to basically say, here's this young man, he's very popular, and it'll kind of balance the ticket out and stuff, so let's just have him on anyway. He didn't expect, obviously, to be assassinated for this man to end up becoming the president. So within this video, we're kind of going to look at what was different about Teddy Roosevelt in comparison to McKinley, and basically kind of seeing just how much of an impact Teddy Roosevelt had, and understanding why exactly is he one of the 4 faces who is on Mount Rushmore. So first of all, the most notable difference between the 2 men is on foreign policy, right? So McKinley was a non-interventionist, just as most US presidents had been, since the time of George Washington, where he argued about there not being tied up in foreign entanglements and in foreign alliances and stuff. And so up until this point, America, for the most part, had stayed out of foreign conflicts, and so they had a very relatively small military, had a very small navy, and it was basically focused in on itself, right? And this all kind of changed with Teddy Roosevelt because, for instance, when you had the Spanish-American War, McKinley, although he was president at the time, had to kind of reluctantly be dragged into leading that war. Whereas Teddy Roosevelt at that time, he ended up volunteering for the so-called Rough Riders, who were a cavalry brigade, and he was very instrumental in the Battle of San Juan and many other engagements there. And he really made a name for himself in terms of bravery, and yeah, so he was very much like very gung ho, and he wanted America to be powerful. He wanted American men to be very manly and stuff, and basically to be a lot more militaristic, yeah, and more war ready than they had been up to that point. And so, as a result, when he finally became president, one of the things that he really pushed for was for America to have a very strong navy. So he was influenced by the book by Captain Mahan, which was the influence of sea power upon history. So basically, within this book, it basically lines out the fact that every great power in history has always needed to have a very strong navy. And that's because even to this present day, it's much cheaper to transport goods by sea than it is to do it over land. And so any power which is able to control the sea is basically going to be able to have a great control over world trade. And this is kind of the root of securing one's own power in the world. And so under Teddy Roosevelt's leadership, America went from having the 5th largest navy in the world to having the 3rd largest navy. And this basically set it on a trajectory to be able to be ready for the next war, which would be World War One. And famously, between 1908 and 1909, you had the so-called Great White Fleet, which was a collection of American warships which sailed around the world. They circumnavigated the world, and this was in order to basically flex America's might around the world, yeah, so that people would know that America is now a world power. It's now a force to be reckoned with around the whole world. However, a little bit closer to home, this is where Roosevelt really flexed his muscles. So you'd had the so-called Monroe Doctrine, which had been set up by President Monroe many years earlier in like the 1820s, and this basically just laid out that European powers were not able to conquer countries within the Western Hemisphere. So all the different countries in Latin America had gained their independence from Spain, from Portugal, and it's basically kind of saying that other European powers should basically keep off it, right? So it's fine for them to have their colonies in the Caribbean and elsewhere, but it was a thing where, from now on, the countries which are independent, they could no longer be recolonized, and America would intervene wherever this took place. However, in 1902, you had the so-called Venezuela affair, in which Britain and Germany tried to bully Venezuela. So Venezuela hadn't paid off its debts, and so what they basically did was they imposed a blockade. Yeah, so they sent gunships and they basically blockaded Venezuela. And in response to this, Roosevelt set up the so-called Roosevelt Correlate. It's got written on the screen now. This is basically his addition to the Monroe Doctrine. It basically said that if any other country tries to attack any country within a hemisphere, they have to basically go for us. So they're going to have to negotiate with America, right? In order to, so if they want to sort out like a debt crisis with Venezuela, they're going to have to negotiate with America first. They're basically going to have to ask America like for permission to be able to do whatever they want in that hemisphere. So this is kind of an addition to it, and and this basically set the stage for a lot of foreign interventions within Central America and within like the Caribbean, and then later obviously within South America as well. So it was basically an expansion of US imperial might, and for the rest of that century, America would play a big role in Latin American politics as a result of this. An absolute keystone to all of this was setting up the Panama Canal. So for many decades, people have been wanting to set up a canal in Panama, just as you'd had the Suez Canal in Egypt. And this was obviously to cut the amount of time it would take to travel from one place to the next. So instead of going straight from the Caribbean to the Pacific, like before this, you had to go all the way down and up around South America. Whereas now you could have the Panama Canal and trade could flow much more easily through this. But obviously the big problem with this was that the Colombians at that time controlled what is now Panama. And so there were some Panamanian rebels who wanted their own independence. And so America, led by Teddy Roosevelt, sent gunships. Yes, this is typical gunboat diplomacy as it was known. And they went down to Colombia and basically threatened them and said, if you don't allow Panama to become independent, we're going to basically invade you, right? And as a result, Colombia accepted. They allowed Panama to get its independence, and Panama signed the agreement that said that the Panama Canal Zone would be American territory. And actually, well into the 20th century, it was still American territory. So all of this greatly reduced the amount of time it would take, for instance, for a ship from the east coast of America to be able to get to the west coast of America, and in particular warships as well. So this basically allowed America to, increase its trade, increase all of its military might, its economic might, and without the control of the Panama Canal, America probably wouldn't be anywhere near as powerful as it is today. And all of this is typified by what Teddy Roosevelt often said, which was the so-called, the big stick policy, right? So as he'd always say, this is a famous African saying, which is that one ought to speak softly and carry a big stick. So in other words, be strong, but don't go bragging about it and stuff. Yeah, the fact that you're strong means that people won't threaten you, means that you can basically live in peace. And this kind of policy extended to President Reagan, who famously kind of referred to it as peace through strength. So the idea that, by America being strong, it would deter foreign hostile powers. Yeah, so a big argument for why was there World War II and the rise of the Nazis was because America was weak. America was not active, and so as a result, it led to a breeding ground basically for countries to think that they could get away with certain things. Whereas if America is strong, then her interests are going to be secured, and there's less likely chance that she'll have to go to war because people will be well aware of just how powerful she actually is. So a big part of American foreign policy for the next century or so has been this idea of peace through strength. And this is why America's military, even today, is the largest in the world. Right, so now that we've discussed Teddy Roosevelt and his foreign policy, now let's focus a little bit more on domestic policy and how he differed from McKinley. So within this, we have to kind of understand that, first of all, obviously in America at the time, you had Jim Crow, you had real segregation between the different races and stuff, and particularly in the South, but also not exclusively in the South, we also had it in the North as well. So one of the things that Roosevelt did was to invite Booker T. Washington, a very famous African-American civil rights activist, and he basically invited him to the White House. Now, obviously, this was met with a lot of condemnation from people, in particular in the South, and Roosevelt, he really argued against this and stuff, and basically said that he wasn't going to be dissuaded by people about this kind of issue. However, obviously, just to kind of keep up appearances and such, from then on, he would still invite Booker T. Washington to the White House, but it'd be through the back door, basically. So it wouldn't be, he wouldn't be officially invited for dinner and stuff at the White House. But still, Booker T. Washington, through Teddy Roosevelt, still had a lot of influence, in particular of who Roosevelt had in his cabinet. So there are many Southern white Republicans known as the so-called Lily Whites, and basically they were very similar to Southern Democrats in that regard, in terms of on the race issue, they were very much in favour of segregation and stuff. And so this is something which Roosevelt was really opposed to, and through the influence of Booker T. Washington, he managed to keep these people out of the cabinet. So only people who were at least sympathetic, to the kind of cause of civil rights were able to be put into the cabinet. Not saying that he was a massive progressive, and but for the time he was very progressive, and it's much better than what would happen with some later presidents, in particular with Woodrow Wilson, and then even with FDR and other people like that, who purposely kind of kept black people at arm's length. So he was a real advocate and champion for civil rights. On top of that, he also flexed progressive credentials. That's quite difficult to say. Progressive credentials, wherever. Anyway, basically, he was very much in favour of what he called the so-called square deal. So this is basically to set the kind of stage for what would later become the kind of welfare state in America. So he advocated for a federal income tax, and later in 1913, this became the 16th Amendment to the US Constitution. And he was also very pivotal in many other forms as well, most notably in so-called trust busting. So what we have to understand in that era was the so-called Gilded Age. So you had large corporations basically being in control of a large part of the economy, and also of politics as well. And there was a great deal of income inequality, and a kind of a feeling that rich people and poor people, the gap between them was getting wider and wider. Stop me if any of this sounds familiar at all. But yeah, so one of the things that Roosevelt did was he broke up the so-called trusts, which were essentially kind of private monopolies. Yes, so you had companies such as like Standard Oil. You had many of the kind of railway companies as well, led by the so-called robber barons. So these were basically people who in today's world would be like multi-billionaires, and so if you think about in today's world, it would be the equivalent of like Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, like these Bill Gates, these kind of people, right? And so what Teddy Roosevelt wanted was to basically break up these large corporations in order to make capitalism more competitive, and also to reduce the amount of concentration of power. Because if power is concentrated, whether it be in the hands of the government or in private hands, that's not a good thing for ordinary citizens. Yeah, you want to have, in a democratic society, you want to have dispersal of power rather than it being concentrated in the hands of a few people. So this is one of the things that he really tried to push for in the Square Deal. He didn't want to impoverish rich people, didn't want to take away all their wealth, but at the same time he was like, actually, if the game gets rigged, it's not good for rich people and it's not good for poor people either. And also as well, he was quite sympathetic to organised labour. So he was one of the first presidents, and to the best of my knowledge, he may have been the very first president who allowed this, yeah. So he had union leaders actually come to the White House. So you had the United Mine Workers, and they basically came to him and said, we want to have like reduced hours, so rather than working 10-hour days, we want to work 8-hour days, and also we want a pay rise as well. So they didn't manage to get the 8-hour days, however this managed to be reduced down to 9 hours, and they also got a pay increase as well. So this was a thing where, this is where you start to kind of see that there's a bit more of a rebalancing within America, rather than just being like pro business all the time, which, it's important in some regards, but it also has to be balanced with a certain level of being pro labor as well, because at the end of the day, a business isn't just run by the people at the top. It's not just the management, it's not just the CEO, etc., etc. A business is also the workers who make up that thing as well, and also the consumers. And also something that Teddy Roosevelt pushed both in his first term and in the second term was consumer protections. Lots of regulations such as food safety and many other things as well. So these were kind of things which started to be pushed by Teddy Roosevelt, and this is the beginning of what we kind of refer to in America as the so-called progressive era, right? So this is where some of the excesses of capitalism kind of reined in a little bit, and like things are kind of set in place for ordinary kind of people and stuff. And then finally, and most notable of all, he was a really, really keen environmentalist. As a matter of fact, teddy bears, right, like they were actually named after him. So like this is because he was really into hunting. And one time that he went hunting, there was a bear cub, and he famously refused to shoot it. And so as a result of that, there was a toy manufacturer, and he decided that he was going to make a series of little cute cuddly bears for children to play with, and he named them teddy bears in honor of him. On top of that, he helped to pass the so-called Newland Reclamation Act of 1902. And so what this basically did was it basically bought up 230 million acres and put it under federal protection, and also helped set up some dams, which also would help irrigate like small farms and stuff. So this was basically a way of basically preserving nature and preserving America's kind of its environmental heritage as such. And there's also a reason why, even to this day, you see the population of America, as we discussed in previous videos, is very much focused on like the eastern part of the country, and there's not so much in the west. And also as well, if you look on the map of what percentage of each state is controlled by the federal government and what percentage is not. So in most states in like the east, the federal government controls a very small amount. Most of it is in private hands. However, out west, most of the land is in the hands of the federal government, and this is because you had setting up of national parks, the expansion of all these kind of things here, which basically help to preserve and help to protect the environment. So we have that to thank for with regard to Teddy Roosevelt, right? Because he helped to really understand that, yes, obviously America was growing as a country, but that it shouldn't. Again, it has to be this kind of balance, between like economic advancement and also a protection and preservation of the environment. So this is one of the things that he really kind of pushed for. So in all of this, when we kind of look at it, you have to be like, right, so if McKinley wasn't assassinated, what would have happened? So more likely than not, Roosevelt probably would have like become president at some point anyway. He was very, very popular. He was also very, very young, and he ended up winning the 1904 election hands down. As a matter of fact, he like really pushed to become the vice president in 1900 because he knew that President McKinley would follow in the footsteps of other US presidents who were following the example set down by George Washington of only serving 2 terms. So he knew that McKinley would more likely not step down in 1904, and then he would basically be able to run then. And he obviously won in 1904, and he was a very, very popular man. Like even in 1912, like when he ended up running against, he set up his own party, the Progressive Party, which became known as the Bull Moose Party. And part of the reason for the name of that was because he referred to himself, and others referred to him as being a tough old moose, basically. And one of the examples of this is he gave a speech, and he was actually shot, so people tried to assassinate him, and he continued the speech and basically kind of said, something along the lines of, "Oh, look at me, I'm just a tough old moose," or something along those lines. So, he was really a pivotal person in American history, right? So modern America today would not be where it is had he not been the president. And while I don't doubt he would have eventually become the president, especially in that first term, it was really, really pivotal, that you had him being the president then. If McKinley had stayed on as president, then a lot of these reforms and a lot of these foreign policy initiatives might not have happened. And this sets the stage of where America would be today. More likely than not, I think like I said, he probably would have become the president. So in some regards, the thing of this would never have happened because he probably would have become the president at some point. But it's always fun to kind of theorize, and just to understand that while history can't always be put on the shoulders of one man or one or even a group of men, it still is a thing where some people unquestionably have an influence on the trajectory of a nation and of the world. So that's something for you to bear in mind as well. So if you like that video, don't forget to hit the like button, to share, and also subscribe as well if you haven't already. The channel is obviously growing, and we need all the help we can get. So we have a Patreon account, so don't forget to donate to that as well. That will really help out the cause. This is my full-time job now. So if you like the kind of content we produce, then please support us in that. In the next few months, we're going to be moving on to film reviews. So we're going to come to the end of this alternative history ones. We've got a few more ideas which will kind of take us over the next few months, but by and large we are kind of wrapping this up now. So that's something to kind of bear in mind. And the next video is an idea which I've had for a long time, and this was the idea which was suggested to me by one of the contributors, but I can't remember their names, apologies. Oh, by the way, sorry, I forgot to say, the contributor of this video was by Satoru Tayo. Oh, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. It will be on screen now. And then the other video, which I was going to be doing next, is what if the Mongols invaded Japan? And that was suggested by someone. I'll try and find out who made that suggestion. But either way, that's what the next video is going to be on. So definitely stay tuned for that one. And in the meantime, have a great day and bye.